Hello everyone, I'm Alan Mankiewicz from the Canadian Centre on Disability Studies. Welcome to our webinar on construction issues related to visitable homes. I'm just going to start by introducing the Canadian Centre on Disability Studies, CCDS. We're a not-profit, consumer-directed and university-affiliated national organization. We're dedicated to research, education, and knowledge mobilization on issues facing people with disabilities. And we strive for the full and equal participation of people with disabilities in all aspects of society. The VisitAbility project that we're working on right now is a 3-year national initiative running till March 2016. The goal of the project is to promote visitable housing across Canada. The objectives are to increase understanding of visitable housing, to increase the awareness of visitable housing, and to develop and implement strategies to promote visitable housing. And this webinar is part of the VisitAbility project. The webinar today will focus on building visitable homes and will run for approximately 2 hours. The webinar will begin with a presentation from Jonathan White on the concept of visitable housing and construction strategies related to that. That'll be followed by a break where we'll show you a video and photos of visitable homes. That'll be followed with question and answers with Jonathan White. We'll have a couple panel presentations with Rob Swan, president of Huntington Homes, and Ron Wickman, an architect who works on visitable housing. We'll follow that up with question and answers with Jonathan, Rob, and Ron, and then we'll wrap up the webinar. Our main presenter today is Jonathan White. He holds a master's in architecture, and he's an architectural research and design associate at the Center for Inclusive Design and Environmental Access in Buffalo, New York. Our panelists today are Rob Swan, co-founder and president of Huntington Homes in Winnipeg, and Ron Wickman, an architect who has a lot of experience in designing visitable homes, and he's based in Edmonton, Alberta. I'm ready to introduce Jonathan White.
Hi, thank you very much. So as Alan just introduced, I'm Jonathan White, and I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar on VisitAbility. I work at the Center for Inclusive Design and Environmental Access at the University at Buffalo, and I'd like to thank the Center for Disability Studies for inviting me to speak to you all today, and of course thank you for joining me. In today's presentation, I'm going to start by talking about the housing problem and defining what exactly VisitAbility aims to solve and why it's important. I'll then define the basics of VisitAbility and talk about how it differs from accessible design. And now a lot of people automatically think that anything having to do with accessibility is going to cost a lot more. And that's not necessarily true given the minimal basic features of VisitAbility. And I'll also be showing you examples of design strategies to achieve VisitAbility, as well as some best practices in VisitAbility. So let me start with the housing problem. And to do that, I need to talk a little bit about demographics. Many demographic trends, including the aging baby boomer population, the generation, lower birth rates, and longer lifespans, all combined forces to create a changing population landscape. The percentage of people aged 65 and older in Canada was 14.1 in 2010. It's projected to be 20% by 2026 and over 25% by 2056. So this is a growing segment of the population and a growing market. Disability rates rise with age, and this is roughly equal for both sexes. And so we're going to have a lot of people getting older. And I want to be clear that not all older people have disabilities, but the incidence of disability is higher. So in other words, older people are more likely to be disabled than their younger peers. And so this aging population is going to need housing that meets their needs. And in Canada, for older people with disabilities, that disability is usually due to increasing limitations in mobility and agility. 14.3% of Canadians report having an activity-limiting disability. And this means that 14.3% of Canadians are unable to perform an activity they used to because of a disability. So we're not talking about jet skiing or playing rugby. We're talking normal, everyday activities like walking, using stairs, getting dressed, and that sort of thing. And so if we look at Canadians over the age of 65, that population, or that percentage becomes 43.4%. So as you can see, the incidence of disability is certainly much higher in people over the age of 65 as compared to the general population. Now, given those changing demographics, let's take a look at the barriers that exist in housing. There's over 1 million homes that have a resident with a disability with unmet housing needs. So this means maybe they can't adequately shower by themselves. Those activity limitations I talked about a second ago. 25% of houses built today will have a resident at some point during the lifespan of the house with a severe long-term mobility impairment. The average family moves every 7 to 8 years or so on average, and a new home will last 100 years or so if built well. So you can see that it's easy to see how 1 in 4 houses will at some point have a person with a disability living there. Now, when you include visitors with disabilities, the probability increases to 97%. So almost every home will have a person with a disability visit the home during its lifetime. And because of these two factors, it becomes critical to improve designs today. Now, 70% of Americans live in single-family homes, and I'm not sure of the exact percentage in Canada, but I imagine it's a similar figure. And this is important because accessibility legislation generally doesn't apply to privately funded single-family housing. And so before I get into the definition of visibility, let's talk a little bit about the general approach to housing, accessible housing in the U.S. Generally, we have laws about public buildings, laws about publicly financed projects, and laws about multifamily buildings. And this is at the national or sometimes state level. And then we have model codes that start as being voluntary and then sometimes referenced by the laws. So the ANSI accessibility standard is one example. And there's different levels of accessibility. A home can be fully accessible for everyone, or partially accessible, or minimally accessible. And ANSI designates units that are fully accessible as type A, partially accessible as type B, and most recently in 2009, they developed type C units, which is visitability. So in the U.S., there could be a law like the Rehab Act or the Architectural Barriers Act that mandates certain housing that receive federal money, like low-income subsidized housing or military housing. The law might say that 5% of these units need to be accessible. And to define accessible, there's a standard for that, and ANSI type A units are basically what they'll have to be. Then for a privately funded multifamily home with 4 or more units, the Fair Housing Amendments Act kicks in and says that all units, or just the ground floor ones if there's no elevator, but all units would need to meet a lower level of accessibility. And so this lower level would be basically ANSI type B units. Now there's no law for privately funded single-family housing, and so this is where ANSI type C and visitability come in. And some local municipalities have actually adopted ANSI type C to cover this gap, but it's not really done on a widespread level at this time. And so what exactly, and so that's what visibility aims to do, to cover the gap in these laws. And we do need it because there's a high cost to a lack of access. There's social isolation. People of all ages or all abilities cannot be invited to a party, let's say at a neighbor's house. 46% of people with disabilities compared to 23% of people without disabilities report feeling isolated from their communities, and for just that reason. There's premature institutionalization. A recent study noted that more than 1/3 of older adults reported being concerned about being forced into a nursing home as a result of barriers in their own home. And they also said they found it difficult to find and afford help to modify their homes to meet their needs. And after discharge from a hospital after, let's say, a stroke or broken hip or other mobility impairment, people are often being discharged into nursing homes because of the architectural barriers in their own homes. And so they're being institutionalized prematurely. Now think about how much that costs per month. On average, it's well over $3,000 per month. And then, of course, there's obviously health and safety risks from falls, inability to properly bathe and toilet, which is a hygiene issue. And, of course, this can be quite costly as well. And then there's a lot of stress involved for everyone. Caregivers, which are usually family members and who are sometimes just as old as the person they're taking care of, and maybe also have limited abilities themselves. They can suffer physical and psychological injuries as well. And home care clinicians report frustration when the family caregiver fails to implement the recommended home modifications. And this happens a lot due to the inability to find funding or find qualified professionals to make home modifications. They just don't know what to do, and it becomes very stressful for everyone involved. So what is visitability? And how is it one small step to making big improvements to this situation? Well, in short, visitability is kind of what it sounds like. It's a house that is accessible enough so that it could be visited by all people, including people with disabilities. Or it could accommodate a short stay for a temporary disability while accessible features are added. And so visitability is looking to make all new homes not covered by current accessibility regulations accessible enough for a visitor with a disability. It was conceived as a way to provide basic access to single-family homes, and it means that a visitable home can at least be accessed. Might not be fully accessible or fully usable, but it can be accessed. And we're calling this a universal design approach because it's not necessarily that the home is universally accessible to everybody, but the idea of making every home visitable in a neighborhood makes the neighborhood and the community more inclusive or more universally designed as a whole. And so it's a big step in the right direction. It fills the gap in the accessibility laws. And as I just pointed out a few minutes ago, the accessibility laws very rarely apply to single-family homes. So this is where visitability steps in. And so what are the key features? The first is a stepless entry at the front, side, or rear of the home, just one at a minimum. And then this and all the thresholds must be accessible. Two, wider doorways, 32 inches or 81 centimeters, and wider hallway clearances, 36 inches or 92 centimeters. And this would be throughout the home, and all of course, the light switches and outlets on this path would be at a reachable height. And then the third thing is that there needs to be at least one accessible or adaptable half bath, or a full bath is fine too, on the first floor. And there are certain size options for this half bath depending on its configuration. The door should be accessible, there should be reinforcement in the walls next to toilets for future installation of grab bars, and so on. And now ANSI Type C adds a few more things that most homes already have on the first floor, which would be like a food preparation area. Most homes do have a kitchen on the first floor already. So the really three main things that I want to talk about today are: one, accessible entry; two, the accessible route through the entry floor level; and three, the half or full bath on the entry floor level. And so again, this isn't really a whole lot of extra stuff. Most homes in the hallways are already 36 inches wide. So the biggest difference is, the interior rooms need some wider doors. Most homes do have a half bath or full bath on the first floor, but possibly that, and a zero-step entrance. And those are really the biggest additional features to a typical home. Now, before I get into the cost and design strategies and how to achieve these three main components, I want to take a quick look at some of the potential barriers to visitability implementation. So home builders and visibility advocates have some different perspectives on four key issues: demand, cost, regulation, and site-specific variables. Now first, taking a look at the home builder's perspective, in terms of demand, they're looking at responding to market demands, and so they say the market isn't demanding visitability. Now, advocates address that by pointing out that builders, one, don't just respond to the market; they often help shape the market. They test out new products, fixtures, and space planning ideas, and they see what they get a good response to, and they build it more often. Advocates also point out that consumers lack awareness of what their accessibility needs are going to be as they age, and so most don't think they will ever need accessibility modifications as they grow older. Thus, the market isn't demanding it because they don't know that they could need it in the future. And so the result is a lot of people later in life making costly upgrades to inaccessible homes or coping with unmet needs. Even with all this, the market is also growing, and so as you saw with the demographics earlier. Builders think that it increased construction costs impacting affordability, and it does increase costs, but our studies, as we'll get into in a little while, show that you could argue that it's really a minimal impact. Advocates also would point out that there's no impact on marketability and aesthetics which is something that we demonstrate in one of the books that I'll put up at the end of the presentation. And I'll go over some more of the cost research in just a minute. The next thing is regulation. Builders don't want to be, whoops, sorry about that. So the next thing is regulation. Builders think that homes are a private matter and visitability should be voluntary. But the advocates look at that and say, well, homes aren't entirely a private matter. Look at safety codes, smoke detectors. There's codes about railings and proper stair dimensions. So there is a public concern in making sure that homes are safe and usable for everybody. And then the last major issue is site constraints. Builders say that site constraints help prevent a blanket regulation for a zero-step entrance. But most known existing laws or proposed laws in the U.S. anyway, they have exemptions for sites where this is really infeasible. And we'll show you in a few minutes some ways of accomplishing this zero-step entry. But first we're going to take a look at the cost. And in new construction, a zero-step entrance can cost somewhere, maybe $150 more. But to do this after the fact, it's going to be $1,000 more. And the reason is that after the fact, you're going to, the level of the home could be a lot higher. And so you might need a ramp or a lift to achieve the zero-step entrance. Whereas, later on, or when you plan it from the beginning, the first floor level can be lowered quite a bit. And then the other thing is widening interior doors. Again, maybe $50 new up front, but to retrofit, of course, now you need demolition to widen the doors. Maybe the house might not even be able to support it because of the way things have been planned out. And so you're talking about drywall and all this, whereas the wider door itself doesn't cost that much more in and of itself. And to show this, we actually did a research study where we contacted several suppliers, and we did a simulated order of 120 doors, 30 each in 4 different sizes, and 3 of those sizes are shown here. A 34-inch door would be required for visitability throughout the house. Visitability requires a 32-inch clear opening, which means a 34-inch door at least. These were single pre-hung 6-panel doors with no casing, hollow core with dull brass hinges. And each of the 5 suppliers, we saw that the cost of the door was not much more. In Boston, it was only $250 more to go from 32 to 34 inches, and that price was the same for 36-inch. Chicago, only $1.54 to go up to 34. And so similar incremental changes were found across other major suppliers in the U.S. And so that's why I said, for wider doors on the first floor, it's maybe not much extra, $50, depending on how big the first floor is. And maybe there's only 4 interior doors on the first floor, and so that you can see it could be somewhere around $10 just for the doors. Now I should point out that this study was done about 5 years ago, so costs might have gone up a little bit since then, but the relative cost, relative to the overall cost, the relative increase should be similar. Now there was also some comprehensive research done in 1979 looking at comparing housing redesigned to meet the ANSI 1980 requirements, which is more strict than the Type C visitability requirements. They did a itemized cost analysis of 9 inaccessible buildings, and they found that the cost of making these units comply with the new ANSI requirement was a 1% increase in new construction in all types of buildings. And that was for a much higher level access than visibility argues for. It would be basically the equivalent of Type A access. And visibility is Type C, which is much lower. More recent research was done in 1993, and they confirmed the 1% finding. Stephen Winter Associates, in their book, The Cost of Accessible Housing, they studied 8 developments around the U.S., and they had 25 different housing unit types, and they redesigned them using 1986 and the Fair Housing Guidelines, which basically the Fair Housing Guidelines became ANSI Type B. So again, here, still fewer features than visitability, and cost data was provided by the developers themselves. We saw fewer than 1% cost increase. Some of the units were only 0.07% more. Others would cost up to 0.87% more. And so the major difference was in site costs. And so as you can see, a $200,000 home would cost on average $1,260 more to meet Type B requirements. But that doesn't necessarily mean that your home will be that's on average. Depending on the site and where you are, that it can certainly go up or down from that. Now, one big thing to know about site costs, why are the site costs the biggest issue? And I would argue that it's the excavation for a full basement is a good reason why the site costs can increase. Let's say you live in an area where there's a frost line of about 4 feet. Full basements are a common thing in those type of areas, as opposed to, say, down in Arizona where it's just flat and they just build on grade a lot of times and don't even have basements. So say if you have frost lines 4 feet down, you dig down 4 or 5 feet, you want a full height basement for marketability, storage, and so they build the rest of that above grade. And so increased site costs go into digging down a little bit more to lower that first floor level to grade. And then there's other issues with sewer and that sort of thing. And so that's where the site costs would come in. Now, of course, you don't need to dig all the way down, the full 8 feet for a full basement. You could, of course, you want to drain water away anyway, so you do sort of want to have it above a little bit, and you can ramp up using some of the fill that was dug out of the basement. But we'll get into that in a minute. And so let's talk about some of these design strategies to achieve some of those 3 strategies I talked about. We'll start, first I want to show you a house here that we designed in our book, Inclusive Housing, the Pattern Book. This house is actually fully accessible, not just visitable, but we're going to use it a lot as an example today. This bungalow is only 910 square feet building footprint. That's about 100 square meters. It took a lot of different inclusive design strategies to make the home accessible, but of course it's also visitable. And so it has a sloped driveway meeting the porch level, but it's still traditional as craftsman bungalow appearance. And it demonstrates how a small space can still be inclusive. It doesn't necessarily add a lot of square footage to the home. And part of the reason that you're able to do this without adding square footage to the home is by having an efficient circulation plan. And so, for example, here on the first floor, the bathrooms, the bedrooms are all off of this one central area, but yet they're still set back and there's still some privacy there. And so rather than having these hallways where now all of a sudden it's taking up space and now you need a couple extra square feet to make the half bath, let's say, a little bigger, now you have that space by just creating efficient circulation. So that's an important thing to do. So here's on the right is another look at that circulation space. On the left, we see here that this isn't a tiny home by any means. We've got a bedroom here. There's plenty of room for a bed, an office. We have bifold doors in the closet to make that accessible. So it doesn't have to really take up a lot of space. Now the bathroom, we've put in a pocket door for easier maneuverability. Visitability doesn't require maneuvering clearances at the doors like most codes would require. We did it anyway in this house, and the pocket door is how we helped achieve that. And here's some examples of how a bathroom can still look good while being accessible. Over on the left, we see a stylized grab bar. Visitability wouldn't even require this; it would just require the blocking in the wall for this. And then we also see over on the right some sinks with knee space underneath, and there's still some storage in between. And again, this wouldn't even be required for visitability, and we'll talk about that in just a second. And so what do we need, specifically? What's the minimum we would need to do for visitability? You would have to have at least a half bath, and you would want to be able to fit a wheelchair space inside of that, and that's your standard 30 by 48 wheelchair space, or whatever the metric equivalent of that is. And so a half bath that's about 60 by 60 or 152 centimeters should be able to do that. And so in this case, the toilet dimension is critical here. If the wheelchair space can fit in the bathroom. ANSI Type C has some more specific requirements. Basically, they talk about the toilet needing a 56-inch deep by 48-inch wide space. But the sink can encroach upon that space as long as the center line of the toilet is 15 inches from that sink. What you probably don't want to do is have one of the half baths where you come in the door centered with the sink to one side and the toilet on the other, because then there's no way to really get that 30 by 48 in there to turn. So you'd want to probably put them next to each other like this to maximize your space. And then there's a couple other things. The door you want to have open outward, obviously, so you can close the door while using the bathroom. And then you might want to consider putting some special hardware on the inside of the door, although the family can really do that later on. But it's tough to reach behind you and close the door, so you can put like a U-shaped cabinet pole if you wanted on the inside of the door. And so to get into a little more detail about the toilets, the top would be the save the most space. Again, there's that 48 by 56 inch space. It's 15 inches from the sink there. This approach takes the least amount of space, but it means a greater transfer distance. Now the one on the bottom also works for visitability. It takes up a little bit more room, but also allows a forward approach to the toilet or to the sink. So if you wanted to have knee space under your sink, you might want to use this one. But this also would require a wheelchair user to be able to do the stand and pivot transfer, which not everybody can do, but also not everyone can do the one on the top. So a really accessible home would allow for both options. So this one says, well, you should be able to use it, but not necessarily. And so here's an example too of a lavatory. The one on the left being the VisitAble lavatory. There's really no requirements in ANSI Type C in terms of the lavatory, but if you're going to have a lavatory, I would say you would want to center that clear floor space on the lavatory. Now the one on the left here has no knee space underneath, so you would have to reach to it from your side and turn, which isn't optimal. And so to show the difference between visitability and accessibility would have the knee space. The drawing on the right would allow for either approach depending on people's preferences. Now, visitability aims to open up doors for two groups: one, visitors, and two, temporary accommodations while changes are made or due to a temporary disability like a broken leg. Now, visitors might not always be taking a bath in the home they're visiting, and that's why it's not required, in terms of ANSI Type C or visitability. But someone with a temporary disability may need to, or perhaps a disabled child or other family member who's visiting and staying the night at a relative's home might want to take a bath. So if there's a bath on the first floor, I would make that the visitable bath. And there's really no extra requirements for that, like I said, because it's not required. But this example here shows how you could do it. So we have a few floor plans here that show how you could make that bathroom a little more accessible if you do have a full bath. But basically, in terms of visitability, the only requirements that are going to remain are the space around the toilet and then the fact that there would be a sink in the room. Again, all the doors you would probably want to have open outward. Basically, I think a lot of these baths here would meet what we would call the Type B requirements of ANSI. Now, a lot of the visitability guidelines are pretty easy to handle. Wider doors, I don't really need to go over. They don't require a whole lot of explanation. Make them wider. And I just spoke about bathrooms, but the thing that most people have questions about is the zero-step entrance. A zero-step entry is usually achievable with grading. It doesn't necessarily result in extra cost unless a retaining wall or off-site fill is needed. But again, also the excavation, if you want a full basement, is desired, and the house needs to be a little lower to the ground. Now, there are a few things you can do to provide this zero-step entry. The first is to use an entrance that will be on the leeward side of the building. And this will help prevent wind from driving water towards the opening. 2, use a covered porch or patio for your visitable entrance. And again, this helps keep water away from the opening. 3, work with the grade or design the grade to minimize the height of the first floor. And this is the most important thing where cost can get involved. And this but what this does is allows a shorter ramp to still be at an acceptable slope. And so you sort of have to do a cost-benefit here. How low can we lower the ground? How much more do we have to dig down? And versus the cost of installing a short ramp. And so a lot of times we see and you'll see in some of the examples later, the house will be lowered a little bit, but there'll still be a little short ramp there because perhaps at that point they figured if we go any further now, the ramp is going to start, if we leave it up too high, the ramp will start getting too long, it'll outweigh the cost, or we just don't have the space. The next thing is a landing outside the door. You can have a slight pitch to that landing, about 1 to 48, which is for all intents and purposes considered level by most standards. You can also have a grate that allows water to pass through, which I'll show you in a second. And you can also use alternative construction methods, which I will go over a few of those in a minute or two. So first we'll start with the lot planning. Sometimes you're developing an entire lot of houses or an entire development of houses. And so on the top you could, let's say this entire development slopes, you could do it differently in each house. So it doesn't always need to be the front or back entrance. Depending on the slope of the lot across the development, you could choose different entrances to be your visitable entrance to maximize to try to minimize the cost of doing this. But also, even within the lot, there's things you can do. So the diagram on the bottom shows, for example, how you can still have a traditional porch on the front and then have a side entry that the driveway just slopes up to the side entry. So here's an example of this. This house is about 3 or 4 feet above the ground, but here they have access from an alley. And by sloping the driveway up to the back patio, first of all, the alley slopes up, and then the driveway slopes up a little bit more. It brings up to the back patio, and now you have a level entrance at the back patio. Now, if you do this, I would say that the loading area at the vehicle should be about a 1 to 20 slope maximum, and then the ramp would be 1 to 12. But the driveway can be steeper than that so long as the unloading area the unloading area is level, and then you would go up 1 to 20 from there. So building up the driveway is a good part. It gets you part way there. And so you see this house here, for example, like I said, it's 3 or 4 feet above the ground. So let's say they had a frost line that was 4 feet below the ground. They really didn't do anything different that much to this house. They just graded a little bit of grading in the back. And again, here, I've seen examples, in the past where they would have a step down from the sidewalk following the walkway would follow the contour of the ground and then a few steps back up to the home. Here, they just bridged that gap with a little bit of a deck to use the grade to their advantage. So now you have a zero-step entrance instead of having steps coming off of this and then a sloping walkway away from that, which is something I've seen. Here you can design the grade to your advantage. If you're not using the natural grade, you might not be able to see it in this photo, but I'll show you in a minute. This is the Life House. It's a fully accessible home, universally designed in the suburb of Chicago. Notice you've got 3 steps in the front here, so it doesn't look short. It's not too low to the ground. But behind the shrubs, there's a walkway that continues up a slight slope. Like I said, it shouldn't be more than 1 to 20. Goes up to the other side of the porch, and then the remaining distance is covered from and hidden from view behind the railing there, and it continues sloping up from that. And so that's one way of using the grade to your advantage. You can also conceal the ramp if you'd like. Again, here this house wasn't designed specially for visitability at all, but we did an intervention where we built a ramp and built a landscape wall to conceal the ramp. In this case, they declined handrails because the son used a power wheelchair and didn't need them. But this was one way of getting up to that first floor level. Again, 3 steps here, so pretty typical height for a home to begin with. And so you can see it's not too difficult. Now, another way people are always concerned about water, and so I think the best 2 ways. The best way certainly is a roof overhang, but also placing it on the leeward side of the building. But one thing you can do if you're still concerned about water is to have this grate here that sits over the drainage stone, so water passes through, it doesn't accumulate and build up on it. But people could just roll right over that. So that's a great way of dealing with the water along the site. Another way is you can use a minimal slope. I should point out I wouldn't use this type of pavers. These pavers probably wouldn't be so accessible. But you can see where you have this denser area, they've sloped all the way to this drainage area here from these doors, and that helps get them helps drain the water away using this drainage system. You can also provide your zero-step entry on a deck, and just like with the example I showed earlier, you could have a grate at the door. Again, make sure it's on the leeward side. Have a roof overhang. So you don't have to necessarily worry about always grading the lot that much. You have your deck at the entry floor level. This way you can pick which side of the lot you need to grade. So you don't always have to say, well, I have like 2 doors and one of them is off of a pretty steep drop-off and I can't do a ramp off that. You build a deck there, and then the access to the deck can be from the side where the grade is a bit closer. So so that's a good way, and or the driveway could just slope up to this deck. Again, here's a image of basically where we put a grate at this door, and it basically just helps with water infiltration. You can use, you can build your own grate using slotted boards, and of course flashing is very important in this case too. Having that deck up at the same level as the doors. Now, some alternative construction methods. One thing that comes to mind here is what I call the reverse brick ledge. Basically, when you do a brick ledge, instead of having the bricks go all the way down below the ground, which wouldn't be that cost effective, they bring the foundation up and they notch it, and they set the bricks on that notch. Here, we've taken the same idea and flipped it around, and we're using that notch to set the first floor on top of. And so typically they say you want at least 6 inches. If you have any finished wood materials between that and the ground. Here, in a typical construction that might be 18 inches or so by the time you talk about the floor joists and all of that. Here we can get that down to 6 inches simply by having a reverse brick ledge. Now this, of course, would be one of the more costly alternatives. Not much more than say a brick house would have, but it uses the same idea as a brick house would use. So now let's take a look at some of the best practice examples. This is an actual VisitAble development. This is in Memphis. It's part of a Hope 6 project, which is basically an affordable housing project. All the homes here are VisitAble. You can see here from the images they all have on-grade entrances, and they used roof overhangs to deal with the water issues, and there's also a slight slope as well, 1:48. And these homes are also fairly traditional in appearance. And here's a Habitat for Humanity home in Atlanta. This has a wraparound porch with a ramp on one side. Again, so Habitat for Humanity, it's an affordable housing project. And this is another Habitat for Humanity home. So you can see this house is pretty high off the ground here. We've got higher than most homes actually, I would say. But rather than build it with the driveway on the other side of the home, they put the driveway on the high side of the grade, and they brought that driveway over to a back deck, which you can see sort of over on the right, and has a short ramp coming off of that back deck down to the driveway. And so you can see here that cost doesn't really have to be an issue, and the house can really still be above grade. You don't really need to dig down, if you want that full basement. Depending on the site, certainly there's ways to do it much more easily. This house here again is an infill housing project, also in Atlanta, also affordable house. You can see it looks like a fairly typical home, but by positioning the way they've designed the deck off the back and its position relative to the driveway, they were able to make it put a ramp there to make the back entrance the visitable entrance. Here again, also affordable housing. Same sort of thing. The front of the house, you can see, is quite far above the ground. But because of the sloping street here, this happened to be a corner lot, they were able to build this ramp over on the side to the sidewalk. And this really wouldn't even necessarily be much any more expensive than, you know, paving a concrete walkway to stairs. Here you're just using wood, so it could actually even be cheaper. Now we'll take a look at a few Canadian examples. There's a visitable community called Bridgewater Lakes in Winnipeg. And here we have a small home where grading was used to get a few inches of rise. And then a covered entryway not only helps keep the water out, but also makes it more convenient for everyone, you know, looking for their keys or juggling grocery bags and that sort of thing. And here's another one, again from Bridgewater, again using a covered entryway to help keep the water away. And yet another from Bridgewater. Notice the driveway and paved area outside the covered patio all slope away from the doorway. And again, the covered entryway. So I hope that these examples help show that it certainly can be done and can be done well and can be done affordably, and that it's being done all over the U.S. And Canada. Before we conclude, I want to let you know where you can get some more resources on visitability. Our website, www.udeworld.com/dissemination/publications.html, there it is, has some free resources. And there's also some publications for purchase. The two on the left here are papers on visitability. The first one goes over a lot of what I talked about, but adds more detail and references. It gives some more of the history, and it's free. The next one's also free. It has a simplified version of the Type C standards I was talking about, as well as some excerpts from our book, Inclusive Housing, the Pattern Book. In the middle is a public policy paper on visitability. It's also available on our website for free. I've also put up here pictures of Inclusive Housing, a Pattern Book. That book goes over a lot of specifics on how to do some of these things. It's a great resource tool for designers. And this book really gets into the design applications, comparing visitability to lifespan design, so you can see the differences and decide to go for more if you can. It also has full house plans and a lot of examples. And a lot of the images I used are from that book. Lastly, there's a link to our textbook, Universal Design Creating Inclusive Environments. It has a chapter on housing and home modifications and visitability as well. Those last two books, the Inclusive Housing and Universal Design, are not free, unfortunately, but the three visitability ones are. We also have a lot of online courses on housing as well, one of which uses the Inclusive Housing book as it's reading. The other chapters all follow chapters in the textbook. Again, there's a course on housing, a half of which covers visitability. There's also a course on home modifications, and then, of course, a second course on housing using the Pattern Book. So if you're interested, feel free to check those out as well, udeworld.com/training/continuing-education. So I hope this presentation gave you a good overview of visitability design applications. Thank you for being with me today. For the University of Buffalo's Idea Center, I'm Jonathan White. Thanks again for watching. We're going to start the panel portion of the webinar now. But first, I want to point out visitablehousingcanada.com. It's a website run by the host of this webinar, the Canadian Centre on Disability Studies, and it has a bunch of information on it as well. All right, so thanks again, and I'll turn it over to back to Alan.
Hi everyone. We're going to reconvene here and ask some questions of Jonathan. The first question we had, Jonathan, would you be okay if we shared this presentation with the people who attended the webinar today?
Yeah, that's not a problem.
Okay, thank you.
I'll have to send you an updated one. I made some modifications.
Okay, sure. Yeah, we'll wait till we receive that and then we'll distribute it. We had another question from one of the attendees, Elizabeth Dunbar. We're going to unmute Elizabeth's microphone.
One of the things I wanted to ask was the challenges in very hilly areas, and wondering, I'm thinking obviously the site planning would then be even more expensive, but thinking of just for instance, example in British Columbia, in Vancouver, the mainland, all along the North Shore Mountains, where there's piles of development going on. And a lot of the examples that were shown, the areas looked reasonably flat. So I'm just wondering how that has an effect, like if a lot of these modifications can still be used, or if there are some that cannot be because of this.
That's an excellent question. Thanks. Yeah, I can't speak specifically about the area of Vancouver you're talking about.
North Shore?
Yeah, I can't speak specifically about that, but I can talk about just generally a lot of times sites with slope on the site, really hilly areas, you can use it to work to your advantage.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I'm just getting a lot of echo and feedback here. So for example, if you have a site that slopes 6% or so, or 6 feet across the whole site, the driveway can slope up, and now you have that entire side of the house. All of a sudden, the front of the house can be 3 or 4 feet above the grade, and then by the time you get to the back of the house, that can be beyond grade entrance. So by building a home sort of into the grade, it can actually work to your advantage if you'd like it to. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, it does help answer my question, and it's interesting because I'm really involved in trying to have even just basic modifications, trying to get into our housing up here more. I'm a real advocate, and I'm just thinking even the design of our roadways, it's amazing how it really unravels all the way down. Because even you'd have to think about even how you design the roadways in order to be able to drive around to get the access in the back on the driveway, right?
Yeah, that depends. Yes. For example, if you want the alley access, for example, then yeah. So for infill, I would say is not necessarily the grade that's the issue, but infill housing becomes more of a problem.
Yeah.
But like we saw, even in some of the examples that I showed, there was one in Atlanta that was on a site where the front of the house was about 5 feet higher. Sorry, my phone is ringing. Yeah, so the one example had the front of the house 5 feet higher or so, and then there was that other really tiny house with a slope, where we had the driveway going up to the ramp in the back.
Mm-hmm.
And so it can be done, and it is done, but I imagine there are sites where it would be more difficult than others. But I think I've showed a pretty good variety of sites within the plan.
Right. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any other questions. So what we'll do is we'll move on to our panel talks, and if Jonathan can hang out around with us for a little bit longer after the panel talks, we will address some additional questions that might come up. So our first panelist will be Rob Swan. He's the co-founder and president of Huntington Homes in Winnipeg, and he will speak about his experience in building visible homes. Whenever you're ready, Rob, you're welcome to start.
Okay, as you just said, I'm the co-founder and president of Huntington Homes. We are a company that does strictly new construction. And I think that listening to some of the things that were said this morning, that new construction is probably a lot easier to ensure visitable housing requirements met more easily than, of course, in an existing home. We're building in Bridgewater, which you had shown some places and talked about Bridgewater Lakes. It's a huge development. It's the largest development in Winnipeg. When I say we're building there, we're building visitable there. It is the only developer in Winnipeg right now that has a requirement for a certain percentage of the lots that they release to be accessible housing. They dictated specifically which lots are required to be visitable, and then they've set the requirements as such for visitable housing. Now, the visitable housing, for the most part, that they have, certainly the ones that I've been involved in, are the higher end, more expensive lots, and all of the lots that they have as visitable housing are graded such They were all walkout basements or visitable. Walkout basements or lookout basements. All of the show homes that we built and all of the client homes that we built over the last 5 years or so in that development are visitable, and they're all walkouts and lookouts. The thing that the developer has specific requirements that are a little bit different than were touched on today, certainly in some areas. Obviously, no front steps is critical to visitable. That being said, they require us to have the front entrance visitable on all of the homes. It can't be a side entranceway or any other accessibility to the house being visitable. It has to be the front door entranceway. The bathrooms require a 5-foot turning radius inside the bathroom, so it's a little bit larger than what was shown in some of the diagrams that were shown earlier. And because of that, that allows us to actually have the door swing in and still be able to have comfortable space with the wheelchair to be able to maneuver around with the door swinging in, because of course that's typically preferred in where you don't have doorways swinging out into hallways. Grab bars, things like that, they are not a requirement. We do put backing into the in behind the drywall for grab bars. We do our own, we not only build, but we do design in-house as well. So when we first got involved in VisitAble, it took us a little bit of time to understand what was required and how to go about achieving that. The biggest change from our typical construction was the grade at the front of the house, of course, is fairly close to the top of the foundation wall, and as such, the sheathing that we use on the front of the house on the first 10 or so, 15 feet down both sides is PWF material. Although it's not touching the grade, it's a lot closer to the grade than would be typical. Doing the plans in-house allows us to put things like the grab bar backing on the plan, whether it's used or not currently. It's shown on the plan, so if someone does require the addition of grab bar backing, grab bars, the backing is already there. So the washroom is probably, the washroom and front entranceway are probably the two biggest differences. The washroom being the size. We found that we had to actually put a sign inside the bathroom because people coming through the home don't, in a lot of cases, understand or haven't seen VisitAble before, and they wonder why the washrooms are so large. So we put a sign in the washrooms so we understand that. The door, the hallways and accessibility and size of doors and things like that, that just had us go from a 2'6" door to a 2'8" door. So there's a minimal cost difference of less than $10 a door to be able to do that. Underneath the sink area, of course, and the height of the sink to the top of the sink has to be calculated out, and that involves them having to actually make sure we select and the client selects sinks that meet the proper requirements. Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I thought I hit a button here while I was moving my mouse around.
You're just a little bit
wider hallways and.
Rob?
I'm sorry?
It might be a little bit quiet on your end, so if you could just lean into your microphone a little bit, that would be great. Okay,
well, I'll pull the computer a little bit closer to the laptop.
Yeah, that's good.
The front entranceway, it was a concern, of course, with being in Winnipeg. We have snow, and blowing snow, and driving rain. Covered front entranceways are typical in that development anyway, so that certainly assists assist that. And when we're ordering our doors, we use Geldwin for our windows and door packages, and they have a different sill that works better for VisitAble than what the typical sill is. With respect to the brick ledge idea, reverse brick ledge idea that I saw, that's a good idea with typical joists, of course. We do something a little bit different. We're using an open web style joist for the main floor, and that allows, which is top hung, and that allows us, we're only dealing with the thickness of essentially a 2x4 above the foundation wall height. So that's not causing big challenges. In terms of the cost of VisitAble, from a new construction point of view, it's really minimal. We've got the PWF material in the garage and along the front of the house and just around the sides, but there is an incremental cost of doing that. But saying that by not putting a front step onto the house or a porch onto the house as such, I would suggest that there's plus or minus no difference from a cost point of view than would be typical. The advantages that I see to the VisitAble, once we've educated the consumer, because it's only been around, as I say, 4 or 5 years, the VisitAble, and a lot of people are not familiar with it. People that are buying new homes that are 50 plus are considering that as a positive thing because of parents that are aging, and whether they're in a wheelchair or a walker or just easier to get up and down the stairs, or not having stairs, and winter conditions with ice and things like that, they're certainly viewing that as a positive. One of the things that I like about it is I think the houses actually look better if the front of the house is lower into the ground, because that's just my personal opinion, I guess, but I actually prefer the look of that, and I think it offers some design opportunities that weren't offered previously when you've got steps. The people that are buying, some of them are buying because they have a requirement for it right now. We just finished a home for a client where he was living in a Huntington home previously, and his wife is now in a wheelchair, and he sold his other house, and we just delivered his new home to him, and he certainly appreciates that. As she's getting older, he is as well, and it makes it a lot more convenient for him to be able to get her in and out of the house and around the house with more open areas. The biggest thing I think that the biggest difference that I see is that years ago we eliminated the use of window wells, and with a walkout basement or a lookout basement, it allows us to put our windows for the lower level, because of course we've got full basements here. It allows us to put the windows towards the rear of the house and at the rear of the house. Therefore, it's not really having much of an adverse effect on windows in the home. But I think that if you were trying to put together a design with VisitAble on a typical rear to front drainage lot, that would be a little bit more of a challenge, because you'd be back to window wells in order to achieve the grading requirements, and as such, window wells create other issues with snow and water and ice and things like that. I think that pretty much covers most of what I have notes on. As I say, the biggest thing I think from a marketing point of view, which is one of the areas I look after in our company, is an education point of view to the consumer, so that the consumer is aware of the added benefits and no detrimental effects by building on a VisitAble home versus building on a building a visible lot rather than a typical walkout lot. As I say, if it was not walkout, that's a bit of a different situation, but all of the ones that we deal with in Winnipeg are all walkouts or lookout basements on the visitable homes.
Okay. Thanks very much for your presentation, Rob. That was really interesting. We have one more panelist, and then we'll take some questions from Rob and our next presenter, Ron, as well as Jonathan, if anyone has any questions for him at that point. Next presenter is Ron Wickman. He's an architect who has a lot of experience in the area of visitable design, and he's going to share his insights with us. Whenever you're ready, Ron, you can go.
Yeah, my name is Ron Wickman. I'm an architect in Edmonton, and I actually grew up with my father being in a wheelchair, so I grew up in a visitable home. This home was built in 1967, and really all they did was they built a typical standard house. The main floor was about 2 feet above the ground, and they built a very steep ramp to the back door. So there really was a kind of lack of understanding both from the builder and my dad as well. And so the ramp actually almost became a last-minute thing. So well before the term visitability came out, I was experiencing it. And then in time, people would come and visit my parents' house, and our back door essentially became kind of the front door. That's where everybody would enter. Myself, I started my architectural practice in 1995, specializing in accessibility. To date, I've been involved in well over 100 homes, renovations and new, to be visitable. And typically with renovations, we would make the back entrance or side entrance the one that was visitable or no steps. And with new homes, it was much easier and more typical to do the front door to have the no-step entrance. In time, I've found that the better conditions to achieve visitability and the no-step entrance, corner lots tend to be offer more options, I guess, easier options. They tend to be often flatter, and in situations where it just is a little easier to have a more gently sloping sidewalk towards one of the doors. I find that when the land is sloping from the front to the back, again, that provides easier conditions to have the no-step entrance. Definitely one of the things that needs to happen is the service lines need to be low enough so that if you do sink the house down into the ground somewhat, your basement floor isn't lower than the service lines. Otherwise, you have to start getting into sump pump issues. So that obviously makes it easier to do the no-step entrance in newer subdivisions where they are already typically building their sewer lines and service lines lower, because there is the trend for people to want to have the 9-foot basement. And the other thing too is the distance from the front door to the public road or public sidewalk. The longer that distance is, the easier it is to have a gently sloping driveway and sidewalk that leads to the front door. So often, as an architect, I'm not always fond of the front car garage, but it does lend itself quite nicely to allowing the gently sloping sidewalk. In fact, that's what I did to my own home. Also a home built, a bungalow built in the late 1960s, and we added a second story to it, and we were able to re-pour our driveway and sidewalk so that it's just a gently sloping sidewalk to to the front door. The challenge is, obviously the biggest challenge is just that, generally speaking, people, builders, consumers, they lack the experience and understanding of what visitability actually is. The other issue, I guess I would say, is in terms of challenges, when the conditions aren't what I just said were good conditions, so steeply sloping sites might be a problem. Just the way roads are laid out and water management is created in some subdivisions can be a problem as well. The other thing that I've learned actually quite recently is a lot of subdivisions, at least here in Edmonton, I'm assuming probably all of Canada, have architectural controls, and often those architectural controls dictate that there should be at least 3 steps to the front door. So if you do want to do a visitable home, you have to sort it out with the developer and get their approval to do something that normally they don't want to see. I've been working with a builder, and some other people have been working with a builder here in Edmonton, Celebration Homes. They're doing a gated seniors community where it dictates that all 42 bungalows in this development have to have the no-step entrance. So this builder, excuse me, shared with us that for sure the first house they did was a challenge. It did cost more money and more time, but with each house that they've been building, it's been getting easier and easier for them, to the point now that they're quite confident in what they do, and they don't see a big issue going into newer subdivisions and creating visitable homes. So they're just about finished their 42 homes in this gated seniors community, and they're just in the process of buying another piece of land in the west end of Edmonton, a new subdivision, where they plan to do another 25 homes as well, with various levels of accessibility, but the standard will be visitability. Also, our group here in Edmonton, working with on the visitability initiative, we're in the process of working with the city administration, try to get some politicians, city council involved. We have an exciting development that's moving forward. Recently, the city closed down our downtown airport, and we have a nice piece of land right in our downtown that has been designed to house 30,000 residents. So we are working really hard to make visitability hopefully the standard. We're still working on what that might look like. Probably a certain percentage will ask to be made visitable, and also try to achieve higher levels of accessibility if we can as well. In Edmonton, we have another group called Home for Life, which is promoting visitability and other accessible features. The city also recently created an inclusive design bylaw, where if builders want to maybe achieve a higher density in their development or a greater site coverage than what's normally allowed for, then this inclusive design bylaw asks for the home to be made visitable. So a kind of incentive program that's relatively new. So I've been around this a long time, but I do feel some real momentum, and I think here in Edmonton for sure the future looks pretty bright for us to really make visitability a bigger part of our culture here in Edmonton. So that concludes my presentation.
Thanks, Ron. That was a great presentation. At this point, we're going to start to address some of the questions we had from the audience during your presentations. We had one question from George Pope. Okay, I can read out his question. He asked about using sliding doors in the bathroom, thereby reducing space inside and outside, so you don't have to worry about door swing. Did any of you want to address that?
Yeah, I can. This is Jonathan. I can take that. Yeah, I don't see a problem with using the sliding door at all to reduce space. You know, a lot of times visitability doesn't require those maneuvering clearances, but anyone who's used a wheelchair will say, well, it's kind of important. And so, yeah, a sliding door is a great way of achieving that without having to worry about the door swing. I mean, typically the door does swing into the bathroom. You could reverse it to swing out to get more space. But also, yeah, the sliding door is a great way of achieving that.
Thanks for that, Jonathan. Does Ron or Rob have anything to add to that?
Well, yeah, just one comment I would make. With the sliding door, with the smaller, as Jonathan presented, the smaller bathrooms that are 5 feet by 5 feet, with a sliding door, it would be relatively difficult for somebody in a wheelchair to wheel, because they would wheel in and then back out of the washroom. So it'd be hard to reach back and be able to shut that sliding door. So I think with the sliding door, you might want to have a slightly bigger washroom where you could maneuver around and gain access to the handle of the sliding door.
I think the only negative to a pocket door, a lot of people don't like them, but if they're built properly, they do function well. I think the only negative to it is it is not quite as good from a sound point of view or sound blocking point of view as a swing door. But that being said, I think that they, as Ron said, if the washroom is big enough where they can maneuver around, which we are required to do here, I don't think that that would be a problem. But that being said, if we've got the washroom that big anyway, then it isn't an issue putting a swing door and having it do a typical in-swing.
Thanks for that. Thanks for those answers. Tom Parker has a question or a comment about the sliding door issue, so we'll address that now before we take the other questions, since we're still talking about that. Tom, we'll unmute you now, and you can go ahead.
Okay. There's a remarkable space advantage to the designer who uses a pocket or sliding door. And we're starting to see them in some smaller condominium high-rise apartments. And in visiting a couple of open houses, noticed a considerable extra floor space that was usable because the door swing didn't interfere with placement of furniture and access was much easier. And the builder had put them in for that very purpose. So we're in Richmond encouraging even the powder room of minimal size to attempt to use a pocket door, and the only design issues are whether the wall into which the door will slide is free of electrical or plumbing and is sufficiently long to accommodate the door once it's in. But we're encouraged that they're being included without a lot of argument because of the fact that it does reduce the wasted space that the door swings into or out of. Any comments on that?
Does anyone have any follow-ups to Tom's comments?
Yeah, I agree with it's Rob here. I agree with what he's saying. The the door is even when it's open, consumes probably an area about 6 inches wide by the length of the door. So on a smaller room, that would it would certainly give a little bit more floor space than would be typical. But again, I think that there's pros and cons to the pocket door in both cases. So.
Yeah, I would concur with that. And I agree with the comments earlier too. That yes, they're a great thing, but yeah, there are some issues like a bathroom, for example, like the one I showed. It's already difficult to have to reach back and close the door, but that can be accommodated by putting a second handle on the door where it's a pocket door. You have to make sure it's built really well and that it rolls and slides easily, because having to reach behind you, you can really only grab it from one spot, and it should swing. Be built very well so that it can just be closed in one pull.
What you need is a Huntington home, my friend.
Yes.
Okay, thanks for those comments. We had another question from Elizabeth, who doesn't have a microphone right now, so I'll ask for her. Out of interest, why are three-step entrances dictated? Does it have to do with water getting in or out?
Well, I guess I'll answer that one, seeing as I brought it up. It's a good question, actually. I think it's just sort of the almost like the history of architecture that somehow these steps create an illusion or an image of moving up into a grander space. So they're certainly the ancient Greeks and Romans, and as an architect myself, we had it mentioned to us many times that stairs were very important to create spatial interest. So definitely there's kind of a historical aspect to it. I think culturally we just think that houses need stairs at the front door to make them look and feel grander. And also, there's no doubt that it has to do with water management as well. So we build with wood, and we want to make sure that we're not letting water get near that wood. So just the way that we've historically built our homes, we would have to think differently to try to get rid of those steps, which obviously Rob has been doing with his homes, and Jonathan with his work as well, and myself. So there's ways to do it, but it's just not the norm, I guess you could say.
Okay, thanks for that, Ron. Does Robert Jonathan have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would agree with that. That it's really from a historical perspective that homes were always built with steps, and so they're trying to make sure that the homes stay this traditional in appearance, and so that's why they would require something like that. And in terms of water, three steps certainly. I mean, unless you're in a floodplain area, three steps certainly wouldn't necessarily be needed, just simply for running or standing water. Of course, like New Orleans would be an exception where the steps would be, because of a flooding issue. But other than that, I would say it's mostly just from an aesthetic point of view that they like the look of steps.
Okay, thanks for that, Jonathan. Rob, do you have anything?
The only thing I would say is that obviously one of our goals, and I'm sure Ron and other people that are involved in design, we don't want people to have to look too hard to find where the entranceway is. We want it to be outstanding and grand. And in the cases with the VisitAble, we're dealing with raising roof areas and things like that over the foyer entranceway, and I think that helps create that grandness to the foyer when you're not using a front step. And I think that and we run the driveway up to be the sidewalk and to be the front patio area in front of where the steps would have been. And I think that there's lots of opportunities when they're contemplated to create the illusion of that, and also to sometimes different is good, and if it's different and it works well, then it makes sense. And that gives us some design opportunities that didn't otherwise exist.
Thanks, everyone, for those responses. Our next question is from Scott, who doesn't have a microphone, so I'll ask on his behalf. As the adoption of VisitAble features are often voluntary, what can individual advocates and consumers do to partner with developers and help encourage VisitAble design? Who wants to?
That's a doozy. I mean, I think this is a presentation like this is sort of why is what our response to that question, I guess, is doing things like this to try to get the information out. There's a lot of misconceptions or just lack of awareness of what visibility is, and that it is something that's pretty simple to achieve if you know what you're doing. I think as one of our other panelists had pointed out, for sure I can't remember who, as you do the first VisitAble home and it comes out to be maybe a little more expensive or difficult than you thought, but as you do more and more of them, you get better at it. Just like really any home, if you've never designed any home before, the first one you do is going to be a little tougher. And so I think it's stuff like this and advocacy that and presentations like this and giving them the information about what it is that helps move it along, because they'll have the same questions that I tried to address here today about cost and marketability and all of that. And so as long as you have the answers to those questions and they believe you, that's a step in the right direction.
I think that developers, not unlike builders, look at the numbers. If they produce 100 lots, 50 are visitable and 50 aren't, and 50 visitable ones sold quicker than the other ones, or even at the same speed, the developer looks at those numbers and says, okay, this makes sense, the marketplace is buying it, or it doesn't make sense, they're not buying it. And so I think that at that point it's us from a sales perspective educating the consumer about the pros to VisitAble. But at the end of the day, once we've done that, it's about what the demand is in the marketplace.
Okay.
Yeah, this is Ron here. I totally agree. In the last couple of years, I've spent a lot of my time talking with developers and builders just to get a better understanding of their world. And one builder I spoke to mentioned that she builds by trial and error. So she builds things, and if they sell really well, then she keeps doing it. If they don't sell very well, then she doesn't. And I was also talking to another builder this past, I can't remember if it was this week or last, but he was just mentioning that builders do spend a lot of time following trends and trying to find ways to separate themselves from the other builders with subtle features that may be appealing to the consumer. So they are looking for trends and ways to set themselves apart from the other builders. One strategy that I think would be good, I just don't know how to make it work, is if you do have somebody advocating for visitability in a city, if that person could orchestrate 100 other people, and those 100 people would phone 3 or 4 of the most prominent builders in that city and just start saying, oh, I'm looking for a home that's visitable. It's a little bit of a sneaky strategy, but builders they'll build things if they're getting enough demand for it. So part of the problem is they're not hearing it enough to really look deeper into it.
And it's increased demand from the consumer's point of view too. It's also about educating the public, but also about educating them about the benefits of visitability, not just in terms of wheelchair usage, but as we saw during the video that they showed during the break, strollers for people with kids, and they can be marketed as homes as like really good family homes, and that grandma doesn't have to go upstairs to use the bathroom at dinner, and the kids aren't going to fall off the stairs to the porch, and the wider doors make it easier to move furniture in and out of rooms. So the other benefits of this are a good way of getting people to really want to request this. Nobody wants to be in a home that they think is too cramped or tiny. So the wider doors and more open spaces and more friendly for family are all things that people want. And so by emphasizing these aspects too, both in the public and to the builders, or developers, we can help make visitability seem like something that's more achievable or more in demand.
Yeah, it's Rob again. When I saw that video with the mother coming out with the stroller with her child, I went, "Hey, that's a good idea. I never thought of that." But certainly, and as you say, it's not just for wheelchairs. When I was talking earlier, I said, people that as they get older, even doing stairs, having ice on stairs. I mean, there's lots of advantages. I think that certainly from our experience, where the developer has basically forced us in the initial stages to build VisitAble by making it part of the architectural controls on specific lots. At the end of the day, they've graded the lots properly to make it easier for us to achieve that with no or minimal cost difference from typical construction. And for those things that you pointed out, not having a porch for people to fall off of, not having to have a handrail around it because it's more than 24 inches off the ground, and other things like that. And I think that those are huge advantages.
Okay, thanks everyone for those responses. That was really good. We have a question from George, one of our attendees. He said, here in Vancouver, accessibility is designed around manual wheelchairs, but he and an increasing number of people are using power chairs. The visitability guidelines you're talking about, are they for manual wheelchairs, or has there been some thought between the distinction between manual wheelchairs and power wheelchairs?
I'll take that question. Unfortunately, the answer is no. And unfortunately, that's really the answer for even the code requirements as well. Right now, even for public buildings, I know in the U.S., and I'm sure the AODA was modeled after the U.S. code in some way, it's the 30 by 48 wheelchair space, which is really the manual wheelchair space. So unfortunately, they're not really universally designed. And again, so things like maneuvering clearances at doors are not necessarily required by visitability, although certain developers and other programs might require the maneuvering clearances at doors. But even Fair Housing Act here in the U.S. doesn't require maneuvering clearance at doors. So other things, or even just the wider space clearances that would be needed. So unfortunately, it's not really considered by visitability. Although visitability certainly helps a little bit, because it gets rid of the stairs at the front entrance. So it's a step in the right direction, but it doesn't solve all the problems.
Just to add to what Jonathan said, I guess the other thing that myself as an architect, I've been trying to also spend as much time as I can with other architects. I think if we can educate the design community, that would help a lot. So I know the Alberta Building Code, I know the ADA has been modeled after somebody using a manual wheelchair. And so when we look at ramps, for example, anytime you have a 90-degree turn or a 180-degree turn on a ramp, it's been more or less designed. The minimum size of those landings tend to easily accommodate somebody in a manual chair, but may not be so accommodating for somebody in a larger chair. So myself, in time now, I've been in practice 20 years. I only take on work that relates to people with disabilities. So my client is, I guess you could say, educated. And when I say we need to make the landings bigger than what the code is telling us, they have complete buy-in and they don't question me. Whereas when I've consulted with other architects on larger projects, often they're looking for me to just confirm that these minimums are what they're going to design to. And if I suggest that they make, for example, a washroom stall bigger or a ramp landing bigger, they've been sort of educated to think that that's just going to mean more money and more cost to the client. So it is something that I think we do need to start to create or start to talk about within our promotion and marketing of visitability, that more and more people are going to be in larger chairs or scooters.
Okay, thanks for those responses. We also gave people the opportunity to write questions when they registered for the webinar, so I'm just going to read some of those out and then we can tackle those one by one. What additional costs are there at any stage of building a visitable home? That might be a bit of a large question to tackle, so if you can sort of go at any aspect of it, that would be great.
I'll start by taking this.
Okay.
You know, the first would be the site and you know, either excavating or grading the site for the visible entrance. The wider doors on the interior, which is really sort of negligible, and then you know, that's really most of it. I mean, there are other things you can encounter depending on the site or this or that. So, for example, let's say you're on an infill site and it's really tight, you know, cramped old city neighborhood. Maybe you didn't want to put a bathroom on the first floor and now you have to. Well, then that, you know, that becomes an issue that you have to deal with and try to fit, you know, you're losing real estate there. So, you know, there's other things that can come up on sites, or as Ron had mentioned, if the sewer lines, you know, and stuff are, you know, are still up too high and the basement floor is down below, then now all of a sudden you're getting into pump issues. And then also looking at the front door, you know, I had mentioned about a grate at the front door or something like that. But the biggest issue is really the site costs, and that can vary depending on your site. If anyone else has anything to add, I'm sure they might. The people who built these might know a little more.
Yeah, it's Rob here. Yes, when I was referring to it's probably a saw-off plus or minus for the revisions and changes required from a construction point of view. That's me making an assumption we're building on a visitably designed lot. And of course, that would probably be the most significant difference, is the grading for a visitable lot. And as I said, in Bridgewater in Winnipeg, where we're building the upper end lots, which is the area that we look to build in, whether they're visitable or not, they're virtually all walkout or lookout basement. So those lots are already dealing with adjustments to the grading. So yes, it's more expensive, but at the end of the day, that's the higher end market anyway. That's certainly the lots that they're looking for anyway, because they want the lower level to be a lower level and not a basement.
Okay, thanks for those responses. Another question we had was, how can visitability features be incorporated with minimum costs? So it's kind of related to the last question.
This is Ron. I don't know. It seems like that question's pretty much the same as the first one. I guess I would just I can't add much to what Jonathan and Rob said to the first question, but I was just thinking there's quite a big difference between working in mature neighborhoods or infill housing compared to newer houses. So it's really great when you have a subdivision where lots have been purposefully designed to allow for easier construction for visitability. That was never even thought of in older communities, and so the biggest problem in inner city communities is typically the service lines are too high, so it's hard to create a basement space without having to either lower the service lines or have some sort of sump pump in the basement space.
I'll add something to that. Also, one time I got a question, about about offsetting the cost, and sometimes the builder can do certain things to offset the cost as well. And I don't mean, people sort of took this the wrong way, that I meant, that they should lower, the grade of features within a home. And what I'm really talking about is that there are certain decisions that are made that really could go either way. So, for example, putting the VisitAbleHousingCanada.com's got a picture of a house with shutters on a 3-bay window. And I would say, well, I wouldn't have put the shutters there, so that could help make up the cost for a little bit of the, the doors and that sort of stuff, because you don't need the shutters because they brought the roof across and there's a lot of depth to the home. They changed the material at the top. And so, the shutters are something that was sort of a design feature that the builder thought, oh, these are nice, and we're going to add the shutters, even though they don't really do much to add to the value of the home. But they spent the money on them anyway. So builders are always making decisions about, weighing the cost of certain features that aren't necessarily needed, and some of those items, like the shutters, or like, shoe molding along a baseboard or something like that, or even the cost of a toilet, which can vary anywhere from, $150 to $1,000, a $50 cheaper toilet. Some people might not notice. So there are certain things that the builder can do if they're really looking to cut costs, but like I said, I think the biggest thing, it really depends on the site. And so in terms of reducing costs, the biggest thing that they can do to have the biggest impact is have a site that's good for it. And so that really depends on a case-by-case basis.
I think on a percentage basis, as Rob talking, I think on a percentage basis of the overall scheme of things, it is so negligible that it's in new home construction that it's almost not even worth talking about. As we talked earlier, the grading is the biggest issue. If the grading is set up to receive a visitable home, the rest of it is immaterial.
Yeah, we found, again, the numbers that we found, it was 0.07 to 0.83% additional cost, and that was for type B. That was for greater level than visitability. So it was not, it was all under 1% increased cost that we had found in our studies.
We're spending more time having us talking about it in terms of value.
Okay, thanks for those responses. We had another question from one of the registrants. What are some incentives or return on investment for a builder or developer building visitable homes? So what can the builder benefit in terms of building these kinds of homes, if anything?
If I could take that, I think the answer is simple. If we have that opportunity of offering a client a non-visitable and a visitable, we've got an opportunity to sell somebody a house in a new development as opposed to retrofitting their existing home or an infill. That would be a marketing advantage for us.
Okay, thanks. Does Ron or John have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would add to what I had said before about, the marketing aspects of the wheelchair friendly and able to move your furniture in easily, and all those other things can help increase marketability as well, I think. But I think Rob's point is the biggest, that there is a market that's currently not going to buy your house if you have steps in front, and people who do use wheelchairs. And so if you can say, hey, come buy this new home in this development, that they'll consider that because their existing home just doesn't work for them. So but there's a marketing advantage there as well.
Okay, great.
Yeah, this is Ron. I was just thinking of a quote from Eleanor Smith, the person who started the visitability movement, and she said something along the lines of a visitable home helps so many more people and hurts no one. And just as a phrase, I love that. I often talk to people and say, with any kind of accessibility feature, I think it really it helps so many more people, as Jonathan said, with baby carriages and bringing fridges in and all moving furniture, all that kind of stuff. So the idea of marketing it that way, I think, is great. The problem I find with something like visitability is there isn't often an immediate payback, if you want to say that. Like it's if you don't need it, you don't see necessarily the value in it, as opposed to, let's say, spending an extra $5,000 to $10,000 on creating a more energy efficient home. you'll start to see those benefits right away with your heating bills. So somehow this idea of the no-step entrance has to be marketed in a way that people do see the value in it, and somehow you almost have to get to a tipping point where having a visitable home actually means having a higher resale value than having steps at the home. And I don't really know how to get there, but that would be an ideal to see a kind of cultural shift in that direction.
Okay, great. We had a question about working with builders. What specific questions could a person ask to a potential builder when they're interested in building a visitable home?
I think that it's Rob. I think that the most obvious one is, what's your experience? How many homes have you built? What do you do different? And an intelligent consumer can talk to 2 or 3 builders or what have you, and they'll get a pretty good handle on it in short order. Which one they have more faith in that is going to be able to do.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Does anyone else have anything to add?
This is Ron. I guess one thing I would add is, and again, because of my work, I often end up talking to people who don't have experience. So a little bit of a trend for me in the last couple of years has been working with young families who have children with disabilities. Cerebral palsy seems to be the most common, but they find themselves in a very very troubled world, I guess, where they just really don't know what to do, and they're seeing their child get bigger, and they live in a 2-story house, and they can't keep carrying their child up the stairs. So they lack awareness of what can be done. So they go to builders, and they talk to the builders, and I've heard more than once a comment from a builder saying, well, you can't have a no-step entrance. The code doesn't allow it. And that's just not true, right? So if the consumer's not aware, they just assume that the builder is telling the truth, and maybe the builder doesn't know, but that sort of thing causes me a lot of stress, because you have to inform, I guess, both the consumer and the builder that this really isn't that hard to do.
Yeah, there's a lot of misconceptions out there, and clearing them up is a tough thing. I would agree.
I'll just address a couple of the comments briefly. A couple of people stressed the need for public education, saying that's really important to get consumers to ask for these kinds of features. We'd like to thank everyone for attending the presentation. We'd like to thank the main presenter, Jonathan White, as well as the panelists, Ron Wickman and Rob Swan. The recorded webinar will be available on our website, visitablehousingcanada.com. If you have any other information you'd like to learn about visitable housing, you can visit our website. And once again, we'd like to thank everyone for attending, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.